Welcome to this deep dive into Stoicism. We have a really fascinating collection of texts here, all about this philosophy that seemed to appeal to everyone, from Roman emperors to, everyday folks. It's interesting how Stoicism always seems to get linked to just enduring hardship. But there's got to be more to it than that, right?
Absolutely. That's what makes Stoicism so captivating.
Yeah.
It's not just like a to-do list for dealing with tough situations. It's a whole intricate system that connects physics, logic, and ethics. This philosophy that really encourages us to examine our place in the universe and live a life guided by virtue, guided by reason.
And that's what we're going to unpack today. We're going beyond that surface level, digging into how these different aspects of Stoicism all work together. Like, how does their view of the universe, their physics, actually shape their ideas about how to live a good life?
That's a key question. And that's where their concept of God, or Zeus as they often called it, comes in. Now, when we say Zeus, forget about the Zeus from those Greek myths, the one always throwing lightning bolts. The Stoics looked at God as this force that's literally woven into the very fabric of existence.
So less about a deity hanging out on a mountaintop and more like an energy or an intelligence that permeates everything.
Exactly. Imagine a fire, the way its heat and light spread out, influencing everything around it. That's a better way to picture how the Stoics saw God. It's this powerful concept, this idea that there's an underlying intelligence actually governing the cosmos. And it links directly to their belief in determinism, that everything happens for a reason.
Okay, now determinism is one of those things that I always find both intriguing and honestly a little bit intimidating. Because if everything is already determined, does that mean we don't have free will? Does it even matter what choices we make?
That is the classic dilemma when it comes to determinism. And the Stoics tackled head-on. They had this brilliant analogy to explain how they saw it. Picture a cylinder and a cone both rolling down a hill. Both are set in motion by that same initial force, right? But the cylinder rolls straight while the cone, it spirals.
Okay, I'm visualizing this. So the push, that represents fate, the things that are outside our control. But then the cylinder and the cone show us that even though we might be set in motion by those external forces, our own individual nature influences how we actually respond.
Exactly. We may not have control over everything that happens to us, but we are always in control of how we react. That's where our free will comes into play. And this is where their emphasis on virtue becomes so important. The Stoics believe that by cultivating virtues like wisdom, justice, courage, temperance, we could actually learn to respond to those external forces in a way that aligns with our nature and with the universe itself.
So it's about becoming more aware of those reactions, the choices that we make in every single moment, and striving to make choices that actually align with those virtues.
Exactly. And that's where things get really interesting because, for the Stoics, virtue was the sole good, not just the highest good, but the only thing that was inherently good.
Wait, so they're saying things like wealth, health, even relationships, those aren't inherently good. Like if I love a big slice of carrot cake, are they saying I shouldn't enjoy it?
This is where we get into their concept of indifference. It's not that a Stoic wouldn't enjoy that carrot cake or value your relationships. It's about recognizing that while those things might be enjoyable, they're not inherently good or bad in themselves.
So it's more about not placing your happiness, that sense of well-being, on things that are ultimately outside of your control. Is that right?
Precisely. The Stoics would argue that you judging that cake as good is shaped by your desires. A Stoic might say, savor the cake, savor the experience, but don't cling to it as the thing that gives you lasting happiness. Because that comes from within, from aligning your will with the cosmos.
So then how do you apply that to the bigger choices in life? Like if someone who follows Stoicism is trying to decide about a career change or a relationship, how do they weigh those options if things like success and love aren't supposed to be the driving forces behind their decisions?
Now, that's a fantastic question and gets to the core of how the Stoics viewed practical wisdom. But before we get into that, why don't we take a quick break? When we come back, we'll explore how this concept of indifference plays out in our everyday lives and how Stoicism can guide us to make decisions that are in sync with both reason and virtue.
And we're back, still diving deep into this world of Stoicism.
It's amazing how this philosophy, which was developed centuries ago, can still offer these really relevant insights for us navigating our modern lives.
It really is. Right before the break, we were talking about indifference, that Stoic idea that things like wealth, health, relationships, they aren't inherently good or bad. It's a very different way of looking at things.
It is, and it can be such a powerful tool, especially when you're trying to make a decision. You step back, you look at those external factors as indifference, and it lets you focus on what you can control. you know,
Yeah.
your own actions, your own judgments.
So if we go back to that career change example, a Stoic wouldn't automatically choose a career path based on which one might offer more money or a fancier title.
Exactly. A Stoic would be more likely to ask themselves, which path is the most virtuous? How can I use my skills, my talents, to actually contribute to the world in a way that feels aligned with nature?
Hmm.
They would be focusing on their actions, lining up with their values, not on chasing after some external reward.
So it's not about pretending those external factors don't exist. It's about like shifting your perspective a bit, right? Understanding that real fulfillment, it comes from within, from living a virtuous life, regardless of what the outcome might be.
Yes. And that brings us to another thing that people often get wrong about Stoicism. They think it's about suppressing all your emotions, becoming this, like, unfeeling robot. That's not what the Stoics are saying at all.
I can see how that misconception pops up. They weren't saying you should just bottle up all your feelings and pretend everything's fine, were they?
No, not at all. The Stoics actually made a distinction between passions and what they called good feelings.
Hmm?
The passions, things like anger, fear, jealousy, they saw those as coming from judgments that were kind of flawed. These big, intense emotions, they flare up when we put too much importance on those indifference, you know?
So, for example, let's say someone cuts me off in traffic and I'm ready to, erupt. A Stoic would say, I'm letting my judgment get totally clouded by this desire for a nice, peaceful commute.
Exactly. A Stoic would probably tell you to take a breath and ask yourself, okay, I get it. This situation is frustrating, but is getting angry actually helping me? Does it align with virtue, with reason?
It's about responding in a way that makes more sense, a way that's more in line with those Stoic virtues we were talking about earlier.
Yes. And this is where it gets super interesting. They didn't say that you should never experience those passions. They actually offered these really practical techniques for, like, managing them, for keeping those passions from running the show. They believe that if we could really examine our judgments, how we see the world, we could start to loosen the hold that those passions have on us.
So it's recognizing that we have a choice when it comes to how we respond to those big feelings, those external things that happen. And by really working on those virtues, we can learn to respond in a way that leads to more peace within ourselves. This makes me realize that even though the Stoics had this very specific view of the universe, a lot of their teachings just resonate, even today.
I agree. And that's why it's so fascinating to look back at these internal debates that were happening within Stoicism. Because even though they shared these core principles, there were some pretty big disagreements about some pretty major concepts.
Like what? Give me an example of one of these big Stoic showdowns.
Well, remember how we were talking about how the Stoics saw the universe as cyclical? How they believed in these cycles of, like, conflagration and rebirth?
Yeah, like the universe's way of hitting the reset button.
Right. Well, that whole idea caused these huge debates about the nature of the self. Some Stoics believe that even though the universe might repeat itself down to the tiniest detail, it wouldn't necessarily be the same individuals experiencing those events in each cycle. That's a pretty wild concept to think about, right?
Wild is an understatement. It's like saying that the universe gets rebooted, but all our individual hard drives, they might not make the cut. So if that's true, does that change how you approach this idea of living a virtuous life? I mean, what happens to the idea of aligning yourself with the cosmos if your self is basically temporary?
And that is exactly the kind of question that the Stoics were wrestling with. And it's a debate that takes us right to the heart of their ideas about logic and knowledge. But before we get into that, let's take another quick break. When we come back, we'll explore those really interesting internal debates and how they reveal just how dynamic, how truly evolving this ancient philosophy really was.
And we are back for the final part of our deep dive into Stoicism. This has really been a workout for my brain, I gotta say, in the best way possible.
That's what's so great about Stoicism, don't you think? It's these ideas that have echoed through centuries because they're dealing with these fundamental questions about, like, how we live our lives, how we understand the universe, and our place in all of it.
Absolutely. And speaking of fundamental questions, before the break, we were just getting started with a big one, the nature of the self. You were explaining how some Stoics believe that even if the universe goes through these cycles of rebirth, it might not be the same individuals coming back each time.
Exactly. And it was a tough pill to swallow, even for some Stoics. I mean, think about it. If it's not actually me experiencing those things in the next cycle, what does that mean for what I do in this one? Does it like lessen the importance of living a virtuous life?
It's a real head scratcher for sure. So how did the Stoics square that idea with, this core principle of aligning yourself with the cosmos, with living a life of purpose?
Well, it all comes back to their idea of logos, the universal reason that governs everything. Even if you accept that our individual consciousness, our sense of self, doesn't carry over through these big cycles, we're all still part of this larger interconnected web of existence. And our actions in this life, no matter how small they might seem, they contribute to the way that universal reason unfolds.
I'm starting to see why there were so many internal debates within Stoicism. These weren't just like abstract philosophical concepts. They had real-world implications for how they lived their lives, the choices they made, even how they understood their own identities.
Exactly. And these debates weren't only about, these huge questions about the cosmos. They argued about logic, about epistemology,
Hmm.
even about the nature of language.
Hmm.
For instance, Zeno, one of the founders of Stoicism, he had this super specific definition of what he called a cognitive impression. It's an impression that's so clear, so distinct, that it has to be true.
So, like, if I see a piece of carrot cake sitting on the table, my impression of that cake is so direct, so vivid that it just has to be real, right? I can't be wrong about it.
That's the idea.
Hmm.
But even something that seems, straightforward like that, it sparked debate. You had some Stoics questioning whether we could ever be completely certain about our perceptions, even those that seemed crystal clear in the moment.
It's like they were the original skeptics, always pushing back on assumptions, even their own. And it makes you think it's pretty relevant to today. In our age of information overload, we're bombarded with news and opinions and all these people claiming to have the truth.
Exactly. And that focus that the Stoics had on critical thinking, on carefully examining your impressions before just accepting them as the truth, that's such a valuable tool, even now. They were ahead of their time in a lot of ways, recognizing how powerful and how potentially misleading our own perceptions could be.
It's like they were laying the groundwork for like the scientific method centuries before it became the foundation for how we understand the world.
Absolutely. And that's a big part of why I think Stoicism still resonates so strongly with people. It encourages us to engage with the world in a thoughtful way, in an ethical way, and with a healthy dose of, self-awareness. It doesn't shy away from the challenges, the things we can't control, but it constantly reminds us that we always have a choice in how we respond.
As we wrap up this deep dive, it strikes me how Stoicism, for something rooted in these ancient ideas, offers this incredibly practical approach to living a more meaningful life. It's not about chasing pleasure or running from pain. It's about aligning your actions with your values, with virtue, with that universal reason that ultimately connects us all.
Beautifully said. And maybe the most important thing to take away from Stoicism is this: real freedom. It doesn't come from controlling the world around us. It comes from mastering ourselves, our judgments, how we respond to whatever life throws at us.
I think that's a perfect note to end on. A huge thank you to you for joining me on this incredible deep dive into Stoicism. And to all our listeners out there, we'll leave you with this. The Stoics believed that the pursuit of virtue, it's a lifelong journey. So keep exploring, keep questioning, and most importantly, keep diving deep.